Hello everyone and welcome to another Middlegame episode with Coach B and MasterChess.com. And this episode it's going to be another episode where we focus on the rooks and we're going to talk about how to steal an open file. As we've seen in the previous video, having an open file is very important because it's the road that your rook and in some cases the queen travels on in order to penetrate into the enemy position. That's why open files are a big battleground by strong players because both sides are trying hard to make it their own. The most common way of stealing a file is by challenging the enemy rook, where they're going to have to make a painful choice. Either to trade on that file, giving it up, or move the rook away from the file, which also gives it up. In this position, black is in serious trouble because his knight will prove to be much worse than white's dark square bishop. If you look around black's king, you can notice that the dark squares are weak, and white's dark square bishop can easily take advantage of those weaknesses. And also, white will manage to take over the d file and use it to penetrate into the enemy position. So in this position, white makes an excellent move, bishop to g5, challenging black's rook. This is a big announcement that he wants the d file. Now black has to make a tough decision. Should he give up the file by taking on d1? Should he try to remain on that file, maybe with the rook to d7 or rook to d6? Or should he run away with the rook, letting white have the file? So let's take a look at all of those options. First, let's take on d1. After this, white will simply capture back. After something like knight to c6, the rook will come to d2, rook to e8, and now queen to d1. Doubling up on that file and preparing to penetrate into the enemy position. After something like queen to c8, after rook to d7, white here has a huge advantage. He can penetrate with the queen to d6 with the idea of bishop to h6, then queen to f6 and checkmate on g7. The queen could also penetrate on d5, attacking the knight, also putting pressure on f7. Here, if black moves the queen to b8 to prevent queen to d6, well, now the queen will come to d5, attacking the knight and at the same time putting pressure on f7, threatening checkmate. The only way to save the knight will be knight to d8, defending f7, but after this the knight can simply be taken and black cannot capture back, as after the capture white will simply be up a queen and win the game. Coming back, after something like rook to f8, defending the weakness on f7, white will simply come to d6, after which black could reply with f6, but after queen to e6, king h8, bishop takes on f6, black is simply going to get checkmated. After something like knight to b8, white here can simply capture on a7, knight to c6, the rook will simply retreat to d7, knight to b8, then we move on to the d file, putting pressure on the other weakness now. Also, white can go for creating a pass pawn as he has 3 versus 2 on the queen side, and also using that to gain an advantage and win the game from here. And coming back, even black's best reply, which will be rook to e6, is also winning for white, and I'm just going to fast forward to the best continuation here. And here white is totally winning. The knight will have to retreat to e6 to prevent checkmate on g7, from which white will pick up the pawn on b5, and then with the extra pass pawn he should win this game pretty easily. Coming back to the very beginning, after bishop to g5, we notice that taking on d1 has devastating consequences. Now let's take a look at the other two options, which are staying on the d file or moving the rook away. If black here moves the rook to d6 to stay on that file, white will simply capture that rook, queen captures back, rook to d1 chasing the queen away. After queen moves to e6, white will move the rook to d5. And here black doesn't have many options. If he retreats the knight to b7, queen to d2 claims the file. After something like c4, white can move to b4, a5, rook to d7 challenging the knight. After black defends the knight, we can move our pawn to a3, h5, then queen d5, going for a queen trade. After queen takes d5, e takes d5, king g7, king f2, king f8, d6, f5, rook to c7, attacking the weakness on c4. The knight cannot capture on d6 because after bishop to e7, the knight is gone. But if he doesn't take, pawn to d7 and rook to c8 check cannot be prevented, where white will be able to exchange rooks and gain up a queen. And coming back after g5, the last option that we have for black is to move away the rook, letting white take control of the open file. Let's say we're going to move the rook to e8. After this, white will simply come to d5 with his rook, knight to b7, rook a to d1, claiming the file with devastating threats. Here, white threatens to move the rook to d7, controlling the 7th rank. Also, the queen could come to the d file and putting tremendous pressure, as we've seen before. Next, we're going to take a look at another way of stealing an open file, learning from a game played by Ivanchuk, rated 2779, versus Anand, rated 2791, played in 2009. This position was reached after 23 moves. If we look at this position, we could see that both players keep a balance on the c file. If either player trades the rooks, the other side will capture and get total control of the file. Therefore, in these situations, the rooks usually just stare at each other, refusing to give ground. However, Ivanchuk finds a way to get past all of that and claim the c file for himself. And here he plays the excellent move, bishop to c7. Now, white will play the rook to c3, followed by the rook f to c1, and finally moving the bishop back to d6, where he's going to have control of the c file. And this game continued with f takes on e5, d takes e5, b6, then rook to c3. Coming back, I do want to mention that white has to be careful here. Moving the rook to c2 would be a big mistake, because here the knight could take on e5, and now white cannot capture the knight, because after bishop takes the knight, the rook will take on c2. However, after rook to c3, the knight cannot capture on e5, as the bishop taking the knight will defend the rook on c3. So the game continued with rook to f8, rook f to c1, another excellent move, rook f5, g4, rook to f7, then bishop to d6. And if we look at this position, white has a much better position. However, Anand was able to produce a miracle and save the game. So from here, I'm just going to fast forward so you can see the rest of the game. And here, both players agreed to a draw. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for more lessons. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.